bear with me a moment. Okay, in fact that was the slide that Dan was just talking through, so I'll move on to the first actual slide of my presentation. So, Oracle licensing, thorny subject. The information about licensing is scattered across many different documents, and not all of them are even available to customers anyway. Some are just for partners' side. One could argue they're often obscurely written. Usually, there's even a conspiracy theory that that's kind of deliberate to lure people into making mistakes and get punished for it. But I think, to be honest, a lot of these rules were written a long time ago, and technology moves on, and they adapt the rules, and it ends up being a bit of a hodgepodge of that you could kind of interpret the wrong way. So hopefully, what we're going to try and do as part of this is to go through some of those misinterpretations and make sure you have the right kind of clinical view of how Oracle views some of these principles. So, like I said, there's lots of sources. They are confusing. So. Working with these all the time is something that I'm engaged in. So I get to hear all the issues and problems and questions and misconceptions. So hopefully that's going to be reflected in what I talk through today. Remember that you may say, oh, well, it's difficult to find out how this should work, but in fact, when you buy Oracle software, Oracle has a contractual right to come in up to once a year to audit your license estate. So you do need to be vigilant, and we're hoping today will help you be a little bit more easy, or perhaps even go away and just check on some things that you might need to kind of sort out in your licensing. So in the worst case scenario, and this isn't necessarily good for anybody really, it doesn't do the relationship with Oracle very much good, but in the worst case scenario, if you're audited and there's a significant amount of non-compliance, Oracle can demand back payments for that period of non-compliance, and that would be at full list price. It wouldn't reflect any discounts that you normally get. So, you know, if you come to Bytes and discuss any concerns that you have, you could make a compensatory purchase just to get things right, and there wouldn't be any penalties. So it is worth bearing in mind. So let's move on. So most of the technology products, probably 95% of them, are sold on two different metrics choice. You've got Named User Plus and you've got Processor metrics, and I'm going to go through these to make sure that you have a very clear understanding of what they actually mean. And I tend to be paraphrasing the actual Oracle phrases here, but they do represent you know, my experience of how things are interpreted. So a user in this regime is either a real individual or an automated device who interacts with the license system. And I use the word interact because there are scenarios where someone definitely doesn't ever have a session with an Oracle system or database, for example. But if they take an action which directly has a cause and effect occurrence in say a database, they will be adjudged to be a user, whether or not they have an identity that that product ever knew about or ever had a session against the database. That doesn't matter. And of course, in the classic sort of model of modern model of internet architectures with, say, browser, application server, and database, you certainly have to reflect users as being at the front end. If the application server has, say, 50 connections to the database, and then there are kind of 500 users coming into that application server, you count the 500, or else you go for processor metrics. So that's called multiplexing. But even in the case of even less close coupling between the person and the system, they may be counted. So one thing it isn't is a measure of concurrency. So up until about 10 years ago, there was a concurrent device metric, for example, and some people still have valid contracts for that. But of course, you can't buy those today. So if you have 500 concurrent device licenses, you can't buy, say, top it up with another 65 of those. You'd have to convert it to processor metric in order to buy some more. So people do regard those concurrent device metrics very closely. Also, it doesn't support the idea of job sharing, which is, you know, for some people a great shame. I know in public sectors you find, for example, some people might be working part-time, someone works 2 days a week, someone works 3 days a week in the same role, but they are two people, and that's how they have to be counted. And I've said, assuming no special contract has been negotiated, because everything's negotiable if you want to go to the trouble of arguing with Oracle and getting it all in writing. So despite it being called named user plus, you are not obliged to keep a register of names. It might be sensible, but Oracle doesn't demand that you publish that. And it is accepted that staff will leave and join, but you just have to be sure that the total number of unique individuals is within your license estate. And remember, if there is a stack of software like middleware and database, you'll need to make sure that both are providing the right cover. They could be on different metrics, but make sure that the connections that come through each layer are covered in one way or another. One misconception I've heard is that people think that using a web style of architecture means that you can't have named user plus metrics, but you can. What isn't possible is, or allowed, would be if in the same way I could go to an Amazon screen and sort of create myself as a user spontaneously. Not that you would license Amazon by nups, but that would rule it out. But the sheer fact of the architecture, if you have a system that you expose to a partner and you can account for all the users and control the user estate, then it is valid. And in the Oracle license and services agreement that you sign when you buy licenses, there is a table of minima for lots of the technology products, so it is worth checking that out. Now, I've put this slide together just to cover off something that used to confuse me quite a bit. How do you calculate named user plus minima? Because various products do have minima that have to be enforced, and especially if you're looking across multiple systems, it can get quite confusing, especially if you try and address each one individually. So this method is the one that Oracle would use, and actually is quite a bit simpler. So I kind of introduced a visual clue into this with a sort of ice tray and the jug of water. So the ice tray represents the various environments that you need licenses for and the sort of minima that are required. Obviously the ice tray probably wouldn't be uniformly shaped because various machines would be there with different specifications. Just to stress that a licensed environment, as I call it, is either a physical server or a valid hardware partition, i.e. one that a hardware partitioning regime that Oracle do document as being acceptable. So, but they're equivalent, so you always do have to focus on what is the licensed environment we're trying to cover here in each case. So if we poured in water into this ice tray and all the compartments filled up, now we empty the jug out of water and pour in what we just filled up. So that tells us what the total of all the minima for all those environments would be. And if you then take a second jug and fill that up to the actual, what I call the blended user count, I'll come back to that in a moment, and then you license whichever is fuller. So if the minima is greater than the actual users, then you cover the minima. If the actual number is greater, then obviously you have to license those people. And what I meant by blended was that there will be examples usually where there are people who use multiple systems. So you don't need to double count. You just would add up the unique individuals, and you don't have to worry about documenting the detail of which systems they use, as long as you're happy that when you blend in all the numbers together, that is the total real individuals that need licenses. So I hope that was clear and helps you work out how to do that. And we will come back just briefly on this next slide as well to talk about NUPS, as you'll see why. So we move on to processor metrics. Now you do need to be aware this means two entirely different things. So here's one of the simplest rules Oracle has. Any product with the phrase Standard Edition in the name, and so that would include Standard Edition 1 products as well, a processor is counted as an occupied CPU socket with no regard to the number of cores. Which, I keep saying, I've been saying for about 3 years, it's kind of quite generous of Oracle, and now we've got sockets with, 12, 16 cores. It's starting to look, quite surprisingly generous, given it's Oracle, but they haven't changed this at the moment. So for every other product, so this is not just things that are called Enterprise Edition, but any product that isn't Standard Edition, you have to look at the cores, and you add up all the cores in all the relevant sockets for your licensed environment, and then Oracle publishes this document on the web which tells you for each chip type what multi-core factor you're supposed to apply. And just a caution, at the bottom of the slide you can see, if you open up that document you'll probably close it off straight away because you'll think it's out of date. It says effective date March 16th, 2009, but at the end of the document, trust me, there's a table of the most recent changes and you'll find it has been updated since. I don't know why they can't fix the title, but there you go. So, as a clue, all Intel and AMD x86 chips are 0.5. So let me talk through what that actually means. So let's take a very typical commodity server with 2 sockets, and each of them has quad-core Xeons in it. So that's a total of 8 cores, and 8 times 0.5 equals 4. So if you have to buy licenses for that environment, that is 4 processor licenses. And when you're asking Bytes, for example, to prepare a quote for you, for example, it's probably worth just giving them the spec, because if you say you want 4 licenses, it leaves the question open. Have you done the arithmetic already with the 0.5? We don't want to be quoting the wrong number. So if you just give the spec, then it'll be worked out properly. And just to mention as well, for NUPS, Named User Plus, you'll find that it says, yes, it's a mandated minimum per processor, but what it actually means is you do the same arithmetic. So in this case, we come up with the 4 processor licenses, and that is the number that we multiply by 25. So in this case, 4 25s are 100. So it's not 200 for the 8 cores, it's 100 for the 4 licenses that we would have, licenses we would have had to buy. And well, here's something slightly surprising, a little warning message. There is no fixed price differential between SE and Enterprise, for example, of the database, Standard Edition and Enterprise Edition. And most people would be confounded by that and say, well, look, the price list gives a figure for the processor metric for these 2 things, and surely that's a fixed differential. But just let's look at this example. So if we had a server with 2 sockets with dual cores in it, so that on a standard edition basis, that would be 2 sockets worth, so 2 processor licenses, so about 23.5K less price. Enterprise edition, we've got 4 cores times 0.5, so we have what I call 2 licensable cores to buy, which is 64K. Now it's quite hard to get dual core machines, and really, quad cores are probably barely any different in price now. So let's use those instead. Well, for standard edition, no problem. We've still got 2 sockets, same price. For Enterprise Edition, we've doubled the number of cores, and that's shot up to 128K list price. So, so you can see there isn't a fixed price differential, and also, overspeccing hardware is extremely punitive. The hardware costs minimal, but the Oracle licensing costs quite significant. Another thing people tend to forget, it is documented in the OLSA document, and I'll accept that this typically helps people who are using chips that have 0.75 multi-core factors. So for the most part today, that's probably the Oracle Sun Spark chips. So what you're permitted to do is to aggregate the count of all those identical type of chips before applying the multi-core factor, and this will probably save you money through rounding losses. So let me explain. And by the way, I used to think that this applied to a specific financial transaction in buying a set of licenses, but in fact the Oracle auditors work the same way. So they'll come and look at the whole estate, take the chips of a certain type, aggregate them, apply the factor, and if you've got those licenses, job done. So let's just talk an example through. So Sun M4000 servers, factor equals 0.75. Somebody wants to use 2 small development and test servers with 2 cores each. I imagine they're going to be in sort of zones or dynamic system domains, which is fine, and a production server with 4 cores. Now the production server is easy. That would have been, so 0.75 times 4 equals 3 processor licenses. If we look individually at the test and dev servers, you've got 2 cores times 0.75 is 1.5, and you think, well, we can't sell half a license, so we'll have to round it up to 2, so that we'd have 2 and 2, and the 3 production would be 7. But in fact, if we add up the 8 cores that exist altogether and then apply the factor, we actually only have to buy 6 licenses, so not inconsiderable benefit from understanding that principle. Something else I discovered about 18 months ago, a little kind of wrinkle about support. So support for Oracle products is theoretically optional, and you'll see why I say it's theoretical. Obviously, you cannot have, you can choose not to have a product supported, but it is all or nothing. Okay, and do remember that support includes the right to upgrade your asset to later versions. the licenses themselves are version agnostic. You don't have a sort of Oracle 10G license or an 11G license. It's just the relevant database edition of whatever version. Now, you might, when faced with your support bills each year, you might decide, oh, I could drop a few items off here. I don't need to support those. They're quite old. But this document I've highlighted on this slide goes on to explain that a license set must have support everywhere or nowhere, and all database editions are considered as one license set. So all your enterprise and all your standard databases, because it's basically the same product code set, they are one set. So you must have support for all databases or no databases. So what I once got to see how Oracle actually enforces this. So if you write back to them and say, we'd like to drop support for a couple of items, they write back and ask you to confirm that you're discontinuing the license, the licenses, not just the support, which you thought you were doing. It would be very easy for someone to kind of write that letter back to Oracle and not realize what they've done. So you would then be not covered, you would be non-compliant for those environments that you thought you were trying to drop support for, but in fact you've actually dropped the right to use the license. So that was kind of something I discovered. I'd also just like to bring your attention to a problem people can get into just accidentally, really. They're sort of busily concerned with maybe a consolidation project, or they've kind of customized some applications. Let's just talk through a couple of scenarios here. So you might own some ISV business applications. That's Oracle partners selling these business solutions that use Oracle technology in them. And typically they're required through what are called ASFU licenses, application-specific full use. And the ISV gets a nice handsome discount on those, and hopefully you get to see some of that discount as well. Those licenses are limited to being used solely with the intellectual property of that specific solution. Okay, you cannot then in that licensed environment start doing other things or customizing the application beyond the agreed scope of the system. There's a comparable situation I should draw your attention to as well, which is even more prevalent perhaps. Oracle's e-business suite. If you buy modules of the business suite, and those are typically sold on an application user metric, so it's quite different to the technology, and you have restricted use rights on certain products in there, so Database Enterprise and Application Server Enterprise Edition, you don't have to buy those, they're there on a restricted use basis. But if you customize beyond the permitted scope, and that is documented, which if you need help with that, we can get in touch with Daniel and we can show you where that information is in detail. But if you do customize, and most people do customize eBusiness Suite beyond those limits, then you would have to buy full use licenses. So that's quite a consideration. So any consolidation or infrastructure refresh projects could lead to illegally mixing some of these together in the same licensed environments, and Oracle will say you need to upgrade to, or migrate as it's called, to full use licenses. So this could be quite an innocent thing that takes place, and you find that you're not compliant. I thought I'd just have a slide on Enterprise Manager because it seems to confuse people, partly because a lot of it isn't written down, because some of the things are actually free and Oracle doesn't bother to tell you that usually. So Enterprise Manager is a sort of umbrella term. Every time you install a database or an application server, you get these specific web consoles called Database Control or Application Control. And then Oracle's acquired lots of other products in recent years, and they tend to get rolled into Enterprise Manager as well. Now, if you've got tens or hundreds of these systems, you really don't want to have all these different consoles. So Grid Control, as it was called, or Cloud Control, as it's now called in 12c, is a central console for all of that estate. So you just go to one place to look at it all. And that control, Grid or Cloud Control, is free in itself. So that's not written down anywhere, but it's never been on the price list. And you are allowed a free database to act as the repository for that. And similarly with RMAN for the record about your backups, that is also free, and indeed can be combined with this one. Another preconception is that you can't manage standard edition with Enterprise Manager, or Grid Control rather, but you can. It's just that you can't use the features that are pertinent to the Enterprise Manager packs, which are only sold with Enterprise. So you can manage the estate, you can start and stop the standard edition databases, check on their general health, and nowadays you can actually make sure that you turn off the relevant links that would take you into areas you shouldn't be using with that edition. And there's a popular myth that people assume might be true, or hope would be true, that you want to license the packs like diagnostic and tuning packs for a handful of DBAs who are going to use them, but in fact the packs have to match the target environment. So if you've got a 16 processor database environment and you want to use diagnostic and tuning with that, then you will need the equivalent number of licenses for the packs. So it reflects in Oracle's eyes, it reflects the value that you're getting out of those on a big critical system, and not just costed on a basis of a handful of users. Another very important area, of course, is high availability and disaster recovery. Licensing models, and the software investment guide, which you can access publicly there, it talks through 4 models, and here's my kind of pragmatic way of looking at them, just to stress a few things that perhaps aren't apparent from the way that Oracle described them. So the backup model is it's a sort of disaster recovery, but maybe not a very good one, but it is free in terms of not having to license that in separate environment. So you keep physical backups, and actually what I haven't said here, but it's really predicated on using Oracle's RMAN backup utility. So what you're keeping is backup sets of that database, and from that, if you had to, you would restore to create a new database when you need it. And that's why you don't have to pay for it, because the 2 databases do not coexist. And that is a kind of crucial undercurrent in all of this. There's another model called failover, which isn't disaster recovery. This is always localized. It's a local cluster with shared storage. And in fact, if you read very carefully, it says the shared storage is within a single array. So if you choose to mirror the data for protection outside the cabinet, then this doesn't apply. And what this gives you this famous 10 days grace per year. So you can have a spare server which can take over from the primary server. There's just the 1 copy of the database on this shared storage, so you're not duplicating the data, but you are supposed to move it back to the primary server after 10 days, which seems a bit unreasonable, but that's what it says. And in 2009, they added some extra wording to this to say that this 10-day principle applies to a specific secondary server, and if there are other servers in a larger cluster and Oracle could fail over to them, then they'll have to be licensed. So this is very, very specific. And the 10-day rule, as you can kind of infer from this perhaps, never applies to any kind of remote system. It's always a single copy within a local environment. The third model is standby, which is predicated around log shipping. It might be using DataGuard in Enterprise, or even in Standard it might be using the log shipping where you have to do some of the work and write some of the scripts. And it has to be, in either case, it has to be licensed on the same metric as production. The quantity might be different depending on the hardware spec that you're running in that standby environment. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, Oracle introduced a remote mirroring clause, and this one upsets a lot of people. So you're not using any Oracle features at all to keep this disaster recovery environment going, but it still has to be licensed. I mean, that's why this clause was introduced, to make people pay for those, because you are cloning the database more or less continuously at a second location. And I've even started to see instances now where people say, okay, but I'm mirroring it on this remote SAN, and the SAN isn't normally attached to anything. So how can we license it? Well, you have to license it on the environment that you intend to bring up when you fail over to DR. So Oracle will not let that go. You do have to license it. I hear all these emotive arguments that people come up with about why they shouldn't pay, but I'm afraid it doesn't really get around the rules. Hardware partitioning. So I mentioned earlier that a valid sort of licensed environment is either a physical server or a hardware partition. So let's look at some of the good things about partitioning. Obviously, if only part of a server is used to run Oracle products, then you can, adjust the license cost sort of fit for purpose rather than licensing the whole server. So that's got to be good. If multiple Oracle products are deployed together on a physical server, then normally you would end up paying for the full spec for both products, for example. So you might have the app server and the database. Why would you license 4 processes of both when in fact they're going to have to share the resources? So unfair as it seems, it's a truism that Oracle licensing rules make you actually think about how you ought to be deploying things because it makes such a big difference. So you could split up the machine into two hardware partitions and license fit for purpose for the 2 products. It also becomes possible with hardware partitioning to have mixed metrics for the same product because you can do that with it. You can separate them into hardware partitions, otherwise you wouldn't be allowed to do that. Okay, and that brings on to virtual server farms. This is quite a thorny subject. To be honest, Oracle haven't really documented very clearly how they view this, but the guy that runs the auditing team in Oracle UK is an ex-colleague of mine at Oracle. I've known him for probably 15 years. I sat down with him recently, and I can assure you that what I'm about to tell you is correct. So here's a typical virtual server farm. Let's assume that these are Intel servers. Each one's got 2 occupied sockets and they're quad cores like we had before. So we've got 6 servers. So you want to run a 4-core virtual machine running Database Enterprise Edition. So with VMware, how many processor licenses are required? Well, amazingly, the answer is 24 because you would need to buy 4 for each server, and that's a total of 24. So in the first place, Oracle doesn't recognize VMware as hardware partitioning, and you can argue whether you think that's reasonable or not, but that's what they say. Assuming live migration can occur, really, then the whole cluster has to be covered. In fact, I raised the question, what if we restrict hardware live migration to, say, a couple of servers? But no, the answer was you have to license the whole cluster. So that's the answer for that one. Now, we've been telling people for 2 or 3 years now that Oracle VM, compared with VMware, can do hardware partitioning. Well, I've now found tucked away in the Oracle support site a document that tells me that that's only true if you don't do live migration. So if we don't do live migration, yes, we could license the 4 cores for example, with Oracle VM. But if it can live migrate, then we're back in the same territory as VMware, and we have to license all 24. Now, here's an interesting thing that's occurred to me. Same environment, but suppose we're running Database Standard Edition. Okay, remember that servers must have a maximum possible spec of 4 sockets, regardless of what they actually look like. So let's say with VMware, how many named user plus licenses are required? So let's assume we have a user community we'd like to have of 17 users. Well, we can actually buy the 17. Okay, the named user plus metric covers any number of servers. Those 17 people can use that product on any number of servers, and there are no minima that kick in per server or per CPU. So magically, SE and NUPS is a very good solution, and I would suggest to people, if you want to run with SE in a cluster like this, that it's possibly worth buying NUPS even beyond the normal cutover point where you might go to processor, because if you buy processor, you'll expose yourself to licensing everything. So NUPS and SE are a magical combination. And I think this is my last slide. This is a slide I use in other contexts to talk about advanced licensing topics. If you're looking to decide, what is the right license and the right price, then these are all the dimensions of the challenge. So just very quickly to go around this. So if we start at sort of 11 o'clock on the picture, so you've got your metrics we've talked about, quantities and minima that would kick in. Sorry, not minima. that would apply to those things. And then there are some specific rules that might exist. So, for example, you can use RAC for free, Rail Application Clusters for free with Standard Edition, but you have to have a maximum cluster of 4 sockets, and you have to use ASM and clusterware, for example. So you need to be aware of some of these special rules that apply. You've then got the migrations topic that might cover upgrading from standard to enterprise, or ASFU to full use, from old metrics like concurrent device to processor. So before you can actually make an additional purchase, you might have to go through this painful process with Oracle of migrating, which we can all help you with. Then another point that just rarely crops up, but because I said that licenses are version agnostic, but in fact, since the technology actually does change across versions, sometimes it's quite difficult to kind of figure out how the rules should be applied to if someone wants to install an old product, what does that actually mean for them? Hosting, that's a complicated topic all on its own, but if you're looking at a situation where you think it might be regarded by Oracle as hosting, and one of the big things there is whose name is on the license contract, but if you have any suspicions it might be considered hosting, just raise it, because otherwise the discount that's quoted may be completely wrong. So have in your mind that you should bring that topic up. Hardware partitioning, standby and backup we've kind of talked about, and then of course there's your production and your dev and test and UAT. So even where production has to be processor based, I would often recommend development or test could be standard edition. UAT, you might have to be careful if you're going to bring in sort of hundreds of people to kind of stress test a new system, then that maybe that would be breaking the number of licenses you've got. So you need to think ahead with that. So just to realize the complexity that we all have to deal with when we're trying to come up with the appropriate license and pricing structure. So I'll think that's my last slide, and I'll hand back to. Oh, sorry, we have got a question here. Let's have a look. So just bear with us here. Virtualised. So apologies for the delay. We're just trying to expand the question window. That's better. Okay, there's a question about Oracle. One question about Oracle HR. I'm not sure quite what the question is there in terms of where cover has been increased over a period of time, but I'm not kind of understanding what the question is there. Okay, well, the licensing sets. Okay, there's another question about where I talked about cancelling support and that all editions of the database are considered to be one set. I think the same would apply to the middleware products as well. So if it was application server or WebLogic, all editions of those would be considered. I think you have to go to that support document to get any further clues. I can't recall if they actually give further details, but where it's basically the same code set with different editions, then they will class it as a single a single product and therefore the same license set. Okay, I think the one on probably on HR and including HR intelligence, that's going to be a bigger question than we should deal with in this context. So if you'd like to get in touch with Daniel, I'll just hand back to Daniel now to conclude the session.
Hello. I hope you found this afternoon's webinar useful. Ron's kindly run through the questions, but if any of you guys would like to have a conversation offline, please submit your telephone number and we can pick that up after the webinar. Yeah, please look out for future Oracle webinars. Thank you.